welcome to another edition of Redleg Roundtable. I am very pleased today to welcome in former Reds player and Cincinnati area native and current Reds broadcaster, Chris Welsh. Thank you so much, Chris.
Well, Seth, good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, hey, you've got all those ties to the Reds, so I've hoped for a long time to be able to talk to you. So thanks for taking the time. Hey, but tell me about this. So you were born April 14th, 1955 in Wilmington, Delaware. How'd you end up in the Cincinnati area?
Well, my dad was transferred. He worked for a big company in the Wilmington, Delaware area, and he was transferred to Cincinnati to open up the West. It was a company called Hercules Powder Company that later became Hercules Incorporated. And basically, he was a salesman, and he sold plastic pellets to molding companies. And one of their big customers were in Detroit, where they made cars and dashboards and things like that. So anyway, we ended up moving from Delaware to Cincinnati when I was about 6 years old. And so that's why I claim Cincinnati as my hometown, even though I wasn't born there. I did all of my growing up there.
If I'm doing the math correctly, would your first Reds game experience been at Crosley? And if you could take me through going to the games for the first couple of times.
Indeed. There were a lot of things. My dad loved baseball, and he took me to a lot of games whenever he could. And we'd get some tickets down there. Sometimes we'd sit in the sun deck. Sometimes we'd get box seats. I actually was able to play in Crosley Field when my CYO team, my Catholic Youth Organization team, was a eighth grader. We played in the city championship game there in 1969, which was the year that they raised the stadium and ended up moving to Riverfront Stadium. And so we all went down there and played. It was such a thrill. I've got some photographs left over from that. I do remember one quick story about that is that, back in those days, we didn't have much in the way of equipment, right? We only had maybe a dozen baseballs and so on. And so when we got to the field and we're going to take batting practice, a lot of us went out there into the outfield to where the terrace was. And we hit balls over the wall just to say that we could hit a home run, in Crosley Field. So then, a little while later, it was time to take batting practice. My dad was one of the coaches, and he said, "Well, where are all the baseballs?" We looked around, and we all had sheepish grins. And sure enough, they were all gone. We weren't able to take BP that day because we already used them up.
That's funny, because my story of lost baseballs was we played right on the edge of a wooded area as a little leaguer, and foul balls would go down in the woods. Sure. And if some dad was willing to brave the poison ivy, he'd go look for him, but you never always found him. That's for sure. Well, hey, so you grew up there in the area. I saw that you went to All Saints School and St. Xavier High School. Did you go to both high schools growing up?
All Saints is an elementary school. It actually is situated right next door. I mean, literally next door to Moeller High School. And actually, it's the same high school that Buddy Bell went to. So he ended up going to Moeller. He was 4 years ahead of me, Buddy was. But I ended up going across town to St. X. Don't ask me why. There were a number of kids in our neighborhood that went to X. A number of them went to Moeller High School. Some went to nearby Sycamore. Some others went to Indian Hill. So we were all spread out all over the place, but I ended up at X.
Well, and certainly with Pete Rose having grown up in the general area there, and then as you and other folks came through, did you get the idea that it was a kind of a hotbed of youth baseball because of all the guys that would go on to play pro ball and things like that?
I never really thought about that until later, to be honest with you. I know it was a hotbed of baseball for me because what I really loved about it is that I was able to play on two teams way back before it's become popular to do that. One was a regular not whole league that we would have games on Saturdays, sometimes during the week. And then we'd have Sunday games on with our CYO league. And the difference when I became like a 8th and 9th grader was that when we would play on a Saturday game, the pitching distance was 56 feet. Yep. When we play on a Sunday, it was major league field size. And I was always held back for the Sunday game. And I somehow tried to add 4 feet to my fastball. It didn't always work out, but I learned how to pitch a little bit that way.
Yeah. I mean, even now, though, I know folks who don't have their kids play junior high baseball, like for their school, because it's the full distance, whereas travel ball up through 7th or so grade is still about 5 feet shorter, about 55 feet. So it is interesting to see those differences and the different kind of ball. Now, you did go down to South Florida. You went to Tampa for college, and I know folks who follow you as far as being an announcer, you've told some of those stories, but can you take me through kind of your recruitment and how you ended up down there?
Well, the short story, and it's a true story, is that I always had a sore arm when I played baseball in high school in spring. And back in those days, we didn't have MRIs and even x-rays. You go to the doctor and the doctor would press on it and he'd say, "Does this hurt?" And I'd say, "Yes." And he'd say, "Well, okay, well, don't throw for a while." And I always thought it was cold weather because we would pitch in snow, when you're in high school ball in March and April up in Cincinnati. So I decided I wanted to go somewhere south. So I sent off a letter to Jim Brock, who was the coach at Arizona State University. That's where all the great players are coming out of, right? Reggie Jackson was coming out of there, and Sal Bando and so on. Later on from there, Barry Bonds would go through there. Terry Francona went to University of Arizona, but all that hotbed for baseball. And I thought, well, I'm going to go out there. And he sent me a letter back that said, "Thank you for your interest in our program. Please list 4 full-time scouts that have seen you play." And that was the beginning and the end of my recruitment process with Arizona State, because I didn't even know one bird dog, much less scout, that saw us play at St. Xavier. So my sister had a former boyfriend who was when she went to the University of Dayton, he was a school teacher at St. Pete High School. He invited me down to take a look at some of the schools that are in the Tampa area. So I went to see Florida Southern, which is in Lakeland. I went to the University of Tampa. I went to see USF. And when I got to USF, I really liked it. It was a beautiful sunny day. I left a snowstorm and an ice storm in Cincinnati. Here it is, 85 degrees in Tampa. Take me to the coach. I went and told the coach, "Here I am." And he said, "Well, I've never heard of you." I said, "Well, I'm pretty good." And he said, "I'll tell you what. If you make the team, I'll give you an out-of-state tuition waiver," which back in those days wasn't a ton of money, but it certainly saved my dad some money in tuition. So I got back on the plane that night. I remember a nonstop Delta flight from Tampa to Cincinnati, got in about 1 a.m., and there's my dad waiting right there at the bottom of the plane steps. And I said, "Dad, you're never going to believe this, but I got a scholarship." And so you could tell then maybe I was better built for broadcasting than actually pitching, because I inflated the story a little bit.
Sure.
But I did end up making the team. I was the only freshman to make the team that year. I got my out-of-state tuition waiver. And as the years went on at South Florida, I became a pretty good pitcher and was able to get drafted from there.
Yeah, in fact, I think you were drafted. Were you drafted back-to-back years by the Yankees?
I was, yeah. I had a very good year my junior year. We graduated all the really good players on our team, came back the senior year. It was a very young team that we got beat up all the time. I got every tough pitching assignment with, Florida and Florida State and Miami and Georgia Southern and, North Carolina, whoever came in, I was the one that was supposed to pitch those games. We didn't have much support. But the Yankees told me that if I didn't want to sign, and they offered me $500 signing bonus my junior year. I was a 24th round draft pick. And at that point, I had a pretty good scholarship at South Florida. So I just declined the offer. And then the next year they drafted me. And I said, "Okay, well, what's the signing bonus?" And they said, "No, we offered you $500 last year. You have no signing bonus this year."
Oh, my.
I'm like, "Well, okay, get me a plane ticket and send me somewhere because I want to play for the Yankees."
Sure, absolutely. Talk a little bit about that, though. Like, certainly the draft was different back then, but tell me a little bit about being drafted and then getting that minor league career started. And obviously the Yankees, even then, were such a historic franchise.
Well, the first year I got drafted, I was a junior, and I was on my way to the Cape Cod League. So I was driving from Tampa to Cincinnati, get my clothes and so on situated, and then driving directly from there to Cape Cod to play in the Cape Cod League. And during that time, I was drafted, and I knew I was drafted because I read it in the newspaper. And so my mom called. I called my mom en route, and I said, "Is it in the Cincinnati Enquirer?" And she said, "Yeah, you got drafted by the Yankees. 24th round." I said, "Okay." So I didn't hear from him. I hung around Cincinnati for a couple of days, never heard from them. Drove to Cape Cod and never heard from them. And then about a week into it, I wrote a postcard, not a letter, but a postcard that said, "Dear Yankees, I'm your 24th round draft pick. Here's my phone number where I'm staying in Cape Cod. If you want to talk to me, give me a call." And sure enough, about 5 or 6 days later, the phone rings and it's the Yankees on the phone. And that's when they made the offer. And they also said, we didn't contact you because we figured that you're probably not going to sign. My college coach, Jack Butterfield, ended up leaving South Florida that year after my junior year and became a Yankee front office operative in the minor leagues. And he was basically telling them that I wasn't going to sign. So that's how they contacted me. It was kind of thrilling, but it was underwhelming at the same time. And the following year, when I did get drafted, I ended up going to Oneonta, New York to get my career going.
All right. That's great. Now, if you go back a little bit, so you're a Reds fan, and I remember stories you've told before about going to the World Series. Could you share that with me? And then also, you shared a pretty good story about, I think was it Pete Rose when he passed recently? Like, did you throw batting practice to those guys at one point?
I did. Both those stories are true. Well, the batting practice story first, I'll tell you, is that when I was a sophomore at the University of South Florida, 19 years old, had a pretty good arm, and it was wild. I went down to watch a Tampa Tarpons game, and I happened to sit next to Chief Bender, who at that time was the head of player personnel for the Reds, was there for a long, long time. Chief Bender was an icon in the game of baseball and in scouting. And we got to talking. He invited me up to pitch batting practice to the Reds that summer. Now, this is the Big Red Machine, right? 1975. So I was all excited, and when my schooling was out for the summer, I went back to Cincinnati my sophomore year and got some jobs up there. And he gave me Sparky Anderson's number to call. And I called his number, and Mr. Anderson answered the phone, "The Happy Family." And I thought I had the wrong number. I said, "Is this the Anderson residence?" He says, "Yes, it is. This is the Happy Family." So I told him who I was. He said, "Yep, Chief Bender's got it all set up. You come on down on Friday night. You can throw batting practice to the Reds." So I went down there. I met Bernie Stowe. He gave me a uniform. At that time, I had a mustache because I had a mustache when I was in college. And I was all set to go on the field. And I mean, in full uniform. And George Sugar, who was one of the coaches for Sparky, stopped me and said, "Hey, young man, you're not allowed on the field with that mustache." And I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, show me the razor because I'll cut this mustache off to be able to go out on the field and throw batting practice to the Reds." And it's exactly what I did. Went out on the field, and I didn't realize at the time. I warmed up. I'm nervous. My arm feels really strong. I'm really wild. And I'm pitching not to the extra guys or not to the pitchers, but I'm throwing to the main squad, the number one group, with Rose and Bench and Perez. And I'm nervous as can be. And so the first pitch I throw, Bench is in there, and I drill him right in the ribs. I'm like, "Oh my gosh." And he throws the bat at the L screen, and he gets out of the cage. And he goes, "I don't need this blankety blank blank." And I'm now really feeling bad. And Perez is supposed to come up next. And he says, "I'm not getting in there." And so Rose jumps into the cage, and he taps the plate and says, "Come on, kid, show me what you got." So the rest of the batting practice routine was me versus Pete Rose, throwing him everything I had. And I finally got the ball over the plate, and he was hitting line drives all over the place, obviously. And it settled down a little bit. So that was my batting practice experience with the Reds.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, you actually played for my hometown Columbus Clippers a little bit before you end up getting shipped out. Is that right?
Yeah, 2 years for the Clippers. Great experience. Loved the whole organization up there. We won our division, or won our title every year with Columbus. Had a lot of really good players. I played with guys like Tim Lawler and Dave Righetti, who came up. Jim Beattie was a teammate of mine. We played for Joe Altobelli one year and Stick Michaels another year. So it was really it was a delight to be part of that organization. Now the downside is that the Yankees were so loaded at the big league level. This is now 1979 and 1980 that they really weren't making a lot of moves to bring players up from the minor leagues. So what they were doing was they were trading groups of players somewhere else to get one veteran in return. And that's what happened to me. I got traded on April 1st on 1981 from Columbus, I was on the big league roster, 40-man, to the Padres in a 6-player trade that sent me and Tim Lawler and Rupert Jones and Joe LaFay to San Diego in exchange for Jerry Mumphrey and John Pasella. And I ended up making the major leagues immediately there in San Diego.
I wanted to bring up John Pacella's name because he had a baseball school here in the Columbus area, And when I got my first job out of college, I was a sports writer for a string of weekly newspapers here in town. And his son, Jay Pasella, pitched and played basketball. He's about 6'7".
Oh,
He
wow.
played for the Olentangy High School Braves here in Columbus. So there was a tie there with Pasella as well, as you kind of passed through the night there.
Yeah. Yeah. John Pasella, every time he'd throw a pitch, his hat would fall off. I don't know if he ever told you that or not. And we would always kid him from the dugout because he was, where was Pasella? I can't remember. Well, I think he was in Columbus in the International League somewhere at some point. And we always used to taunt him from the dugout about how his back's got to hurt more from picking his hat up than anything else.
That's funny. That's really funny. Hey, but you did make that major league debut on April 12th, 1981 with the Padres. Everybody probably remembers that day when they get to make a big league debut. What was yours like?
It was the second game of the year. I was very nervous. They were holding back the ace of the staff, Rick Wise, to start the third game of the year, maybe fourth game, because we opened up in San Francisco. It was a beautiful sunny day in San Francisco, and there were about 55,000 people at the Candlestick Stadium. And I was obviously nervous, had only been around the ball club for just a few days. Excuse me. And so I thought, well, I better get this done. And as it turned out, the very first batter of the game was a guy named Billy North, and he hit a ball dead center field, a bomb, and Rupert Jones caught it up against a center field fence with his back to home plate. And I said to myself, man, that's the leadoff hitter. What am I going to do when we get down to the meat of the order? Anyway, I think I went about 4 or 5 innings in that game, walked away with a no decision, ended up pitching against the Giants the next rotation around when they came to San Diego, and I pitched 4 innings of 1-run baseball. I think I held them to 4 hits that day. So I ended up getting my first big league victory that day.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, and so on that debut, you went 6 full innings, though. You gave up 7 hits and 3 strikeouts. That's a good day.
Yeah, well, in those days, 6 innings was probably the minimum of what you set your sights as. Nowadays, if you go 6 innings, they're ready to pop the champagne.
You're a hero. That's funny. Well, so 2+ years there, and then you end up going elsewhere after that. Talk to me a little bit about the ebbs and flows of being a big leaguer and spending that time you did there.
It's it goes so quickly. If I had to do it again, I would probably maybe take it a little bit more seriously. I see what the guys do now as far as dedication to the craft. And, for us, it was fun. It was a job. We worked hard. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I didn't loaf or anything like that. But I really thought that my career, once you get there, is going to last 15 years. And it just doesn't always do that. So I think that what you learn up there is that everybody at that level is really good. Everybody I played against was more athletically talented than me. So I had to figure out a way to get these guys out, whether it was changing speeds on a curveball or coming up with a new pitch, likely an off-speed pitch of some kind, honing up a pickoff move, doing the little things, fielding your position, things like that to try to keep me there. Because I was one of those pitchers, because I didn't throw hard. They were not likely to give me as many chances as a pitcher who threw really hard and was wild. Mm-hmm. So they looked at me as a polished pitcher, and I better, if I'm getting it done with smoke and mirrors, I better continue to get it done because your time is going to be up. So that was the thing for me. I never got to the point as a major leaguer where I could kind of sit back and relax. Never had a multi-year contract that I could kind of cruise into, anything like that. I was trying to fight my way onto a roster every year. Some years I made it, some years I didn't. Sometimes I started in the minor leagues. Sometimes I got called up mid-season. So I was definitely a journeyman pitcher. I mean, I pitched for 4 big league teams in 5 years. So it was a very enjoyable struggle, if I could put it that way.
That's good. That's good. You end up in Montreal in '83, and I think Terry Francona was a teammate there, was he not?
Yeah, he sure was. Tito, great guy. Tito kind of reminded me of myself, but as a position player. Mm-hmm. Although he was a better ball player than he appeared to be. And I always thought that I was a better pitcher than I appeared to be. If you watch me warm up in the bullpen, you're thinking, this guy's not going to get anybody out. And I think Terry Francona the same way. You watch him hit batting practice, he never really hit many home runs. He wasn't especially fast, although he was just fast enough to steal bases. He was very clutch. He had great hand, bat to ball skills. Francona did, and you could tell even back then he understood the game and he understood what it took to be a good teammate.
Well, so hey, I assume you faced some of these guys such as Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and Tony Perez and Joe Morgan in the big leagues. What were those moments like for you? And did you ever kind of get used to it, or was it still kind of like, oh, these are the guys that I grew up watching?
No, I never got used to it. I was always especially nervous. In fact, in that 1981 season, my rookie year, I pitched against the Reds. That was a split year, if you recall. You may not, but it was a year in which there was a baseball player strike for 56 days, and the league ended up having a first half winner and a second half winner, and those winners would play each other and then go to the playoffs and so on. And the Reds lost. The Reds had the best record in baseball that year, but they lost out by one game of winning either half.
Yeah.
So it was in September, mid-September, that the Reds were coming through California. They came, I think, through San Francisco, then LA, and then they played in San Diego, and I pitched a 9-inning shutout against them. And I think I won. I think it was 4-0. And it kind of set them on their heels because now they really had to go back to Cincinnati and win out. But that was a day in which I pitched against, that's my real close recollection of that game was that Johnny Bench was in the lineup for the Reds, and they still had a pretty good team. This wasn't the Big Red Machine from 75, but they obviously, having the best record in baseball, still had a pretty good team. And I remember facing Bench the first time, and he hit a ball to dead center field, old Jack Murphy Stadium. I think it was 420 feet to center field, 17-foot wall. Rupert Jones again against the wall, catches it right on the warning track. And Bench came running around the mound, and he said, "Hey, go warm up," implying that I didn't throw hard enough for him to be able to hit one out. Next time up for him, same thing happens. This one's a little bit deeper, closer to the fence. Rupert Jones snags it for the out, and he comes running by, and he says, "Blankety blanket, go warm up." And the third time, same thing happened. And and this was time Rupert Jones was in right center field. I mean, way up against the wall. He catches the ball, and Johnny Bench comes by and he says, "Welsh, blankety blank, go warm up." And I said to myself, Johnny Bench knows my name.
Hey,
I mean, if nothing else happened that night, I thought that was pretty cool.
That is amazing. Yeah.
I always respected him as, the best catcher in baseball, and really the main guy in that glue that kept the 75 team together.
So I know you went to the Rangers, but let's go forward then. In 86, you pitched for the Reds, your hometown team. You're playing for Pete Rose. I know you told the story about kind of he helped make sure you were on the roster, or he told you had a spot. I forget what the exact story was. You can clear that for me. But what was that like being with your hometown team, but also playing for Pete?
Well, I'd run out of options. That was a year, if you go back and look at baseball history, there was collusion going on. Peter Ueberroth was the commissioner. And he was telling all the teams, don't talk to free agents. And that included released players. So I was released previously by the Texas Rangers the year before. I'm looking for work. I wrote a letter to every general manager in baseball. I called every team. I got hung up on, no, we're not signing free agents, even released players. So here we are the day before spring training, pitchers and catchers to report, and I didn't have a place to go. So I had heard that Pete Rose was going to film a commercial at my old college stadium up at University of South Florida. I drove up there, saw Pete between shoots, and he said, "Hey, Chris, good to see you. Where are you going to be?" I said, "Haven't you heard, Pete? I'm going to be with the Reds." And he said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "No, really." I said, "It's not happening." I talked to Bill Burgess, the general manager, and he didn't want anything to do with me. He said, "That SOB don't run this ball club. I run this ball club. You be down at Al Lopez Field tomorrow at 8 a.m. I'll have a jersey with your name on it in the locker." And sure enough, I got there at 7:55, and there's my name on a jersey in the locker at Al Lopez Field. So, I went through spring training, had a terrific spring. I think the first two batters I faced in the spring were hit doubles. One of them was Billy Beane, the future general manager of the Oakland A's, and of course the Moneyball guy. Then I didn't let another batter the rest of the spring, I think over 16 innings, to get the second base. Didn't walk a batter. Had a really good spring and did not make the team. But I showed up on the day that we're supposed to leave with my bags packed, ready to go to Cincinnati. And in fact, they threw my bag on the team bus, and we were just about headed to go to the Tampa airport. as when Mario Soto said, I think my arm is going to be good enough to make that opening day start after all. So they tossed my bag off to the side. I stayed behind. I went to Denver where the Reds had a AAA. I later got called up a few weeks later, and that's how I made my major league debut with the Reds. But really, it was because of Pete Rose taking a chance on me that I ended up being with the Reds. So I will always and ever be indebted to Pete.
What was your experience like with him as your manager?
It was great. I mean, here's a kid that grew up in Cincinnati. We all wanted to beat Pete Rose, right? We all, we fought for number 20 when the, knothole uniforms were being given out. I would have to pinch myself, just talking to him and being in the dugout with him. And then I realized that, this is real. I mean, this guy wants to win every pitch, every at bat, every inning. And it was contagious. And he was a terrific motivator. He knew the game very well. I had no idea anything else off the field was going on with Pete Rose. I had no sense of any impropriety going on, gambling or anything like that. I just knew he wanted to win. And that we had a pretty good team, but just not good enough to beat the Astros in '86.
When I started collecting baseball cards, it's that 1987 Topps set, and you are in that set as a Red. And so I know it was only one season there, but for me, I always feel like you were there much longer because of the fact that I had that card, and as a younger kid, I looked at it all the time. Francona on that team as well, right? So you end up.
Yeah, he was. The interesting thing about that, and Buddy Bell was on that team as well. I played with Buddy in Texas, and I also played with Buddy in Cincinnati. But the interesting thing there, maybe it's more of a piece of trivia than being interesting, but I started 25 games for the Reds as a pitcher that year. And when Barry Larkin was called up from the minor leagues and Pete played himself, he was a player manager. When he played himself about half the time at first base, when that combination happened, we had 6 players on the field at the same time and went to high school in Cincinnati. So, Dave Parker, who, congratulations to Dave, just recently notified that he's going into the Hall of Fame, well-deserved. Ronnie Oster was at second. Larkin was at short. Buddy Bell was at third. Pete was at first, and I was on the mound. So, I mean, basically the whole infield was a Cincinnati infield. So that was something that Marge Schott really thought was cool. And I remember we got our picture taken for Us Magazine with Marge and with Shotzi right there at Riverfront Stadium. And that was probably one of my most cherished photographs, to just stand there, be with all those guys. The only bad part about that is I remember, I think I'm standing next to Dave Parker, and I look like a bat boy compared to him.
That's right. Yeah, he was definitely the man, that's for sure. Could you see at that point, because you mentioned Larkin, and of course Eric Davis was already up, and maybe I know Paul O'Neill was either there or was coming. There were guys coming. Could you see even in '86 the beginnings of something that would happen in '90 with the World Series?
Yeah, I think the talent they had in AAA was immense. It was really, really good, and I think a lot of the credit really for that team in 1990 should go to Pete. I mean, I know that Lou Piniella came in and put it all together. They had the Nasty Boys that came into their own, and Rijo came over and had a great year and so on. But, a lot of those players and that foundation was set by Pete Rose. But, they had some great players. And all those guys, the one thing I noticed about the Reds players in Cincinnati and in AAA when we were in Denver is they really cared about each other. And I think sometimes that's an overused little word, but it really makes a difference. And I kind of sense the same thing going on with this coming Red season this year. Right. These guys really care about each other. And boy, that's worth a few wins a year. I'm not sure when you're going to get them, but it's worth a few wins.
Yeah, that mix in 23, especially when Matt McLean was there, that group that you're talking about, the current group, seemed very close, and it seemed evident then. Well, so let's transition then. You've spent over 30 years now as a voice for the Reds, mostly TV. You've done some radio. How did that start for you, and what does it mean to you to be there for so long now?
It's I still pinch myself. Well, first of all, I wonder where the time went, number one.
Yes.
And number two, I wonder how the heck did I fool these people for this long? In broadcasting, it's an interesting job because you keep your bags packed. I've had never more than a 3-year deal, but really what it was when you sign a 3-year deal with Fox Sports or with Sports Channel Ohio, they're 3 1-year deals, so they can cancel you basically at any time. So it's not like a guaranteed contract like a player or a manager gets. So you're on your toes. You have to be careful what you say, but you have to understand that you've got to be fair in your commentary. You've got to be well prepared. I've always kind of, been making sure that I'm well prepared, that I don't get caught trying to BS my way out of a situation where I should have known what's going on and don't. I've been very lucky to have worked with really some great broadcasters. George Grand for 17 years, the greatest, nicest man I've ever met in baseball. So knowledgeable about every part of the game. I worked with Marty Brenneman for a lot of those years. So when he would come over from radio during the 6th, 7th, and 8th innings, or maybe 5th, 6th, and 7th innings on the over-the-air games. So I got to work with Marty quite a bit there. He was tremendous. And I think the other thing that I'm not going to answer that. That's just probably a routine emergency. But what I can tell you is that, and I get to work with Tom Brenneman, who is a terrific announcer and a wonderful man. I think he got jobbed worse than maybe anybody in the sports history when he lost his career as a Reds broadcaster. And now I'm with John Sadak, and all of those guys terrific. And I think that, as a former player that becomes an analyst, they lower the bar of expectation a little bit for you. They don't expect you to speak the King's English. They don't expect you to be a wordsmith. They don't expect you to be able to make a big call on a big-time home run that's going to live forever and ever. I get paid for saying things like, boy, that was a great play.
Yeah.
But it's deeper than that. I think you've got to understand the game. I think you have to work hard at understanding the players. And it's been a joy. I could not, if I sat down, Seth, and tried to make a job description of something that I wanted to do for 30 years, I don't know if I could come up with anything better than being a Reds broadcaster.
Well, hey, one thing I've always wanted to ask you if I got the chance to talk to you, and I want to say this as delicately as I can because I don't mean any disrespect to either man, but when you work so long with George Grand, and George is positive all the time, like the spin, not even spin, but around the team, he wanted us to get to know the players in a way that you guys seem to know them so well, but he wanted to put the Cincinnati Reds out to us as the public in a way that would make us feel good about the team, even in those rougher years, right? And then you go to work with Tom Brenneman. And I think immediately, I still remember that first year, Tom maybe got a little more critical than George would have. And I wondered how that was for you, kind of going from one to the other, because that style of the guy kind of leading the conversation was so vastly different.
That's really a good point. It's thinking about that, and I have thought about that over the years, and even when it was happening. I mentioned the guys that I've worked with as Reds announcers. I left out Paul Keels, I left out Jim Kelch. And I've worked a lot of Saturday Fox games as well. I used to work with Frank Messer when I was doing college baseball. He was a very good announcer who did New York Yankee games for years and years. So everybody has their own style and their own approach. I think it's important for those guys to get together and get along. And I got along with every announcer that I worked with. And I never wanted to critique his style. So sometimes with George, we would just kind of roll right along because I wasn't really going to say anything negative, although we would be called out sometimes and say, hey, why aren't you a little critical about these guys making these errors, blowing that big lead or, not showing up on time. You need to be a little bit more critical about that. And then sometimes I would weigh the other way when I'm with an announcer that maybe doesn't, look at it as sugary as George did. And I would be, hey, let's give this guy a break a little bit. It's almost like, I used to listen to Marty and Joe, and not only when I was growing up, but also when I was broadcasting games for the Reds. I would sit in the radio booth sometimes when I was not working as a TV, and I listened to them. And Joe was a guy that would kind of balance out Marty a little bit. So I always thought that the balance in the booth is probably the most important thing. Don't get too sweet. Don't get too sour. Always try to find a middle ground, play off each other. But at the end of the day, remember that broadcasting baseball is number one, entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, it's entertainment. Number three, it's probably education. And depending on if you're a hometown broadcaster or a national broadcaster, sometimes you slant your broadcasting of one way or the other. But I think it's all about balance and understanding that everybody who's listening to or watching a game has issues. Maybe their mom is sick. Maybe their kid is failing at school. Maybe the dad just lost his job or the dog has died. Whatever it may be, everybody's got issues. Nobody wants to turn on the TV or the radio and listen to your issues. They don't want to hear you complain. They don't want to hear you get angry. They're here for entertainment. They love the Reds. They're turning you on every night because they follow your hometown team. And once I adopted that understanding, it became a lot easier for me.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now, you mentioned earlier you want to be prepared and you like to not get caught off guard. So you've created this niche. You've got the Baseball Rules Academy website, and I follow you on Twitter @ThinkPitch. I mean, you are constantly updating with rules and showing us the viewer or the people reading you on Twitter, like what exactly is going on with the different rules of baseball. And I guess, has that always been a passion of yours, is to really know those rules? And it really does help you, I'm sure, as you're calling the game.
It was never a passion. I did it out of embarrassment, to be honest with you. Here's how it started. I was in a booth one time with George Grant, and there was a play at the field. And I always thought that I knew the rules because I was a former player, right? I even umpired a little bit growing up. And then something happened on the field. It was a kind of a quirky play, and we go to break. And I said, well, when we come back, I'll have the answer to this rule and let you know what's going on. We come back, and I'm thumbing through the rule book, which is a convoluted collection of rules and interpretations that you really can't find anything in. It was very poorly written, still is actually, but and I got caught basically with my pants down, like, oh, I'm sorry, folks, I've tried to look up the rule. I don't know what's going on. And at that time, of course, there was no communication between the umpires and the broadcast booths. So we didn't know what was going on. Why did that runner end up at second base and the runner at home, was out, whatever the play was. So I decided right then and there, I said, you know what, I'm going to learn the rules. So I started reading the rule book as much as I could. And then I decided to make a database. I did it with back in those days, I think it was Lotus 1, 2, 3, but basically it's an Excel sheet of where I would put in common phrases, and then the rule number would pop up. So I could type in, runner gets hit by thrown ball. Mm-hmm. And then this rule would pop up. And then I realized, man, this just doesn't cover anything. And so I decided, well, why don't we just make this a little bit more of an effort, and then I'll make it free to anybody who wants to learn the rules, because I think broadcasters should know the rules. I think youth league baseball coaches should know the rules. They're probably Uncle Seth, who might be, umpiring there in Columbus, for your nephew or your niece or somebody like that. Maybe you should learn the rules. So I ended up starting this rules website, Baseball Rules Academy. I grabbed a couple of umpires that were like Ted Barrett, who was willing to come out to a ballpark and spend 2 days of 8 hours a day taping every rule we could think of. So that was about 10 years ago. So now 10 years has gone by. I have a full-fledged website. It does have a premium pay level, but you can also look up any rule you want free. And this year, actually, I've been working very diligently on coming up with a rules online baseball rules course. Which will be very easy for people to understand. I think it'll be great for coaches and umpires and so on to learn the rules in a fun way where there's going to be a lot of video. There's not going to be a whole lot of reading. It's not going to be like a college textbook. So that's my passion isn't so much about rules as it is about educating people about baseball.
Absolutely. Well, hey, so I've got two more things. Number one, I guess we're here recording in December of 2024. Things are changing with broadcasting of baseball, especially with the Reds. And if you don't know anything yet, that's fine. But I have to ask you, do you have any knowledge of what's going to happen as far as who's going to call the games? Are you going to be involved? this, that, and the other coming up in 2025?
I have really no knowledge except the fact that I'm going to be involved in some way.
Okay.
So other than that, I don't know a thing, anything. I mean, I'm learning like you out of the newspaper. I expect to talk to the Reds in detail in the next few weeks and figure it all out. But at this point in my career, I've been blessed. The Reds have been very loyal to me. I'm loyal to the Reds. I love this ball club, and if they'll have me back, I'm willing to come back.
Well, that sounds great to me. And I guess the last thing I'll ask you about, and I'll do it for both as teammates of yours, but also players you've called games for. Could you give me some players over the years that really stand out to you, whether you had just really good memories or relationships with them, or guys you enjoyed covering and calling games of?
You mean as broadcasters or players that were on the field?
Some teammates, players while you were playing. Who were some of those guys that really stood out?
I was playing, there are a lot of guys that I really respected so very much. Ozzie Smith was probably the first one that wowed me when I went to the Padres. When I came up with the Yankees, I mean, this Yankee team that won the World Series in '78, I was in their big league spring training in '79 and '80. Traded away in '81. I mean, we're talking about Thurman Munson and Tommy John. I used to follow Tommy John around and ask him, hey, do you ever put anything on the ball, like make it slick or make it sticky or anything? And I think he got tired of me asking all spring, and he stuck his finger in his nose. He pulled out a big booger and he put it on the ball and says, this is what I do right here. So that was the last time I asked him that question. But yeah, I mean, I remember Dick Tidrow was a guy who was a reliever for the Yankees, who was a very good and knowledgeable baseball guy. Over the years, there have been so many players. The Reds players that have come through have been, Rich Aurelio was one of the smarter baseball players I remember putting on a Reds uniform. I used to love to cover Scott Sullivan.
Yes.
Because he was kind of a self-made man. I mean, here's a guy that didn't even make his college team, and here he is pitching for, 15 years or so in the major leagues. So those guys that play hard like that, I love being around them. There's so many players. I mean, Ryan Hannigan is I'm a big fan of his.
Yeah.
David Ross the same way. So, I mean, I could go on and probably pick 2 or 3 names off of every Reds team that came through. But I've enjoyed every one of them. And you got to remember that when you assemble 25 different men together, you're going to have a lot of different personalities. That reminds me of a story that I used to hear. You hear it all the time now. And it's like a manager's secret. If you've got, say, 24 players on the roster, that means you basically have 8 players that you love so much that you would love to have them as your son-in-law. And then you've got 8 players that you hate so much you don't want to even have them in your own clubhouse.
Right.
And that leaves the 8 neutral players. And the key to good managing is making sure that those 8 neutral players don't hang out with the 8 bad guys.
That's right. Right.
If you can do that, you're going to have a good ball club. But
yeah,
I love baseball stories, little mottos like that. And I hope I get another couple of years to use them.
Well, that'll be great. And you mentioned Ryan Hannigan. I just came across a Facebook memory of apparently when he got either traded or let go, or he was leaving Cincinnati. And I said, best of luck, Ryan Hannigan. And this was a bit of a shot at the time, but I said, may you never have to bat 8th in the order just because you're a catcher again. I felt like that's kind of, he was the catcher position in that era was relegated to that 8th spot. Of course, pitchers batted back then. So
yeah.
I guess
he was tremendous. He and Bronson Arroyo were like super tight, right? I mean, he was Bronson's personal catcher. I think it was just before David Ross was. I may have that wrong, but I remember I told Arroyo one time, because Arroyo was out there inventing pitches in the middle of a game, and I said, "Hey, Bronson, every time you drop down, you're throwing a curveball, because maybe you ought to drop down and throw a changeup." He said, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll try that. So he worked it a couple times in the bullpen, and so he throws it in the game. He drops down, he throws this changeup that comes in really slow, and it breaks the opposite way of his curveball. And the umpire asked Hannigan, what the hell is that pitch? And Hannigan said, I don't know. It was something one of our broadcasters told him to throw. So anyway, those are the kind of stories you get along the way that are awful fun.
Well, yeah, I'd love to share those with you even longer, but I've kept you long enough. Thanks so much for taking the time today, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Seth, my pleasure. I hope to get to see you down at the ballpark.
All right, hang on one moment.